The Mitford sisters were British aristocrats who gained immense notoriety in the 20th century for often scandalous reasons. As such, some were hated, but others were loved.
You will not believe what these six sisters did. One sat next to Hitler at dinner. One was locked up in prison. One put a bullet in her own head. One fled the country to fight in a foreign war. They grew up in the same house, slept in the same bedrooms, and shared the same parents. So how did it all go so catastrophically wrong? The answer will genuinely shock you. This is the story of Britain's most scandalous family.
Lady Moseley, your family has been described as a savage tribe. Now, do you concede that title?
We may have seemed a savage tribe to outsiders, I suppose.
But not to you?
The sisters who divided a nation, horrified the world, and changed history forever. Few families in 20th century Britain managed to attract as much attention, admiration, and outright scandal as the Mitfords. Six sisters, all born to the same parents within the space of 16 years, ended up on almost every side of the political spectrum imaginable. One became a celebrated novelist. One dedicated her life to the countryside and her animals. One married a fascist and was imprisoned during the Second World War. One became so obsessed with Adolf Hitler that she shot herself in the head when Britain declared war on Germany. One ran off to Spain to fight alongside the communists and later became one of America's most fearless investigative journalists. And the last one married into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in England and turned a crumbling, stately home into one of the most visited tourist destinations in the country. Together they have been described as the Duchess, the fascist, the communist, the Nazi, the novelist, and the other one. It is quite a list. To understand how six women from the same household ended up living such dramatically different lives, it helps to start at the beginning, with the family they came from and the world they grew up in. The Mitford family is one of the older families in England. Their roots in the country go back further than the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror crossed over from France and changed the course of English history. At that time, the family was headed by a man named Sir John de Mitford, who presided over Mitford Castle in Northumberland, a county in the north of England close to the Scottish border. What is remarkable is that the family maintained a presence in that part of the country for the next 8 centuries. That kind of continuity is rare even by the standards of English aristocratic families. By the time the 6 Mitford sisters were born, the family was led by their father, David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, who held the title of 2nd Baron Reddersdale. He was, by most accounts, a deeply eccentric man. He was conservative in his politics, unpredictable in his moods, and not particularly easy to live with. That said, the family had a respectable history behind it. His great-great-grandfather had been a well-regarded British historian in the early 19th century, which gave the family a certain intellectual credibility, even if that legacy was not always visible in the day-to-day life of the Mitford household. Their mother was Sidney Bowles, a woman who came from a similarly accomplished background. Her father, Thomas Bowles, had been a member of Parliament as well as a writer and publisher of some notes. He founded several magazines during his lifetime, among them the original Vanity Fair, which was one of the more prominent publications of its time in Britain. So on both sides, the Mitford children grew up surrounded by a family history that included writers, public figures, and people who had played some role in shaping British cultural and political life. David and Sidney married in 1904, and their first child, Nancy, arrived just months after the wedding. That was followed by Pamela in 1907, and then their only son, Thomas, in January 1909. Their third daughter came along in 1910. There was then a gap before Unity was born in August 1914, just days after Britain entered what would become the First World War, a conflict in which their father served on the Western Front in France. Jessica followed in 1917, and the youngest, Deborah, was born in 1920. 7 children in total, 6 of whom were girls. Thomas, the only boy among them, never made it to middle age. He was killed in the final months of the Second World War in 1945 while serving in the Pacific theatre of the conflict. He was in his mid-30s at the time. His death was a significant loss to the family, particularly given how close several of the sisters were to him. The 6 sisters, however, nearly all went on to live long lives, with most of them reaching their 80s and 90s. The household they grew up in was, by most descriptions, an unusual one. Their parents were eccentric in ways that went beyond the ordinary quirks of the British upper class. For a period, David and Sydney even experimented with the idea that children should not be spoken to in anger or rebuked for bad behaviour, a rather progressive concept for the early 20th century. The results were apparently not encouraging, and the experiment was abandoned fairly quickly. The children were largely educated at home by private tutors and governesses, rather than being sent away to school, at least in the early years, which meant they spent a great deal of time together on the family's country estate. This upbringing had different effects on each of them. Some thrived in the relative isolation of country life. Others found it stifling and could not wait to get out into the world. The sisters were strong-willed and opinionated from an early age, and their relationships with one another were rarely straightforward. There was genuine affection between many of them, but also fierce rivalries, political disagreements that would eventually become unbridgeable, and a great deal of the teasing and one-upmanship that tends to develop in large families where the children are left largely to their own devices. Their parents' influence on the direction their lives took should not be underestimated. David was a deeply conservative man with strongly held views and a short temper. Sydney, meanwhile, showed an increasing sympathy for fascism during the 1930s, a political movement that was gaining ground rapidly across continental Europe at the time. That sympathy rubbed off on some of her children more than others, and it set the stage for some of the most dramatic and, at times, deeply troubling chapters in the family's story. The Mitfords would go on to become one of the most talked-about families in Britain during the 20th century, celebrated in some quarters and condemned in others, sometimes for very good reason. What makes their story so compelling, even now, is not just the extremity of some of their choices. It is the fact that these 6 women, raised in the same house, taught by the same people, and shaped by the same parents, ended up seeing the world in such fundamentally different ways. The same childhood produced a committed fascist and a committed communist, a duchess and an investigative journalist, a woman who dined with Hitler and a woman who marched with civil rights activists in the American South. Understanding how that happened requires looking at each of them in turn, beginning with the eldest, Nancy, and working through to the youngest, Deborah. Their individual stories are extraordinary on their own. Together, they add up to something that feels almost impossible, and yet every part of it actually happened. Nancy Mitford was born on the 28th of November, 1904 in London, the eldest of the 6 sisters, and in many ways the one who set the tone for the family's reputation as a group of women who were impossible to ignore. Her childhood was shaped by the same eccentric household that all the Mitford children grew up in, but Nancy responded to it in a particular way. She became sharp-tongued, competitive, and fiercely intelligent, qualities that would define her for the rest of her life. Biographers have noted that the brief experiment her parents conducted with a more lenient style of parenting in which children were not to be scolded or spoken to in anger seemed to have the opposite effect on Nancy to what was intended. Rather than becoming calm and well-adjusted, she reportedly became difficult and prone to outbursts when she did not get her way. Her parents put an end to the experiment and returned to more conventional methods, but by that point, certain aspects of Nancy's personality had already taken hold. Like her sisters, Nancy received most of her education at home through tutors and governesses at the family estate. It was not always a harmonious environment. Nancy was the eldest, and she made use of that position. She was known to tease her younger siblings relentlessly, and her dominance within the group was something that several of her sisters wrote and spoke about in later years. But alongside that difficult side of her character, there were early signs of the writer she would eventually become. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, Nancy took it upon herself to put together a family magazine called The Boiler, to which she and her siblings contributed pieces. Her own contributions at that stage leaned towards murder and mystery stories, which says something about where her imagination was already taking her. When Nancy turned 18 in November 1922, she made her formal entry into British high society through her debutante ball, an event that carried considerable social weight at the time, particularly for a young woman who had spent most of her life in relative seclusion on the family estate. The following summer, she was presented at the royal court and met King George V at Buckingham Palace. From there, Nancy quickly became part of a loose but well-known social group that came to be called the Bright Young Things, a circle of aristocratic sons and daughters in the 1920s who were known for their artistic interests, their bohemian attitudes, and their enthusiasm for parties. The group included figures who would go on to become significant cultural names, among them the Sitwell siblings, the poet John Betjeman, and the writer Anthony Powell. The most accomplished of them all, however, was Evelyn Waugh, who would later write Brideshead Revisited, published in 1945. Waugh and Nancy became close friends during these years and remained so for the rest of their lives. The social scene that Nancy moved in during the 1920s was an extravagant one. The decade following the end of the First World War was a period of considerable economic prosperity in many countries, and in England, that translated into a culture of lavish parties, heavy drinking, and a general desire to enjoy life after the devastation of the war years. Nancy was very much at the center of this world, and it gave her plenty of material to draw on when she eventually started writing in a more serious and sustained way. Her literary career began to take shape in the second half of the 1920s. She started writing a regular column for a publication called The Lady Magazine, and shortly after that, she began working on her first novel. The decision to pursue writing was not entirely out of character for the family. Her great-great-great-grandfather on her father's side had been a respected historian in the early 19th century, and her maternal grandfather Thomas Bowles had been a writer and publisher who founded several prominent magazines, including the original Vanity Fair. Writing, in other words, was in the family. Her first novel, Highland Fling, was published in the spring of 1931. It centres on a group of aristocrats gathering at a party in the Scottish Highlands, and it drew heavily on her own experiences among the bright young things, with many of the characters based on people she actually knew. Her subsequent books in the 1930s, including Christmas Pudding in 1932 and Wigs on the Green in 1935, followed a similar pattern of blending fiction with thinly veiled autobiography. While she was writing these books, her personal life was considerably more complicated. In the late 1920s, she had been in a relationship with a man named Hamish St. Clair Erskine, the son of the Earl of Rosslyn. The relationship was unfulfilling for reasons Nancy may not have fully understood at the time. Erskine was gay, and he had in fact been in a relationship with Nancy's own brother Tom at Oxford University while simultaneously seeing Nancy. The affair dragged on until 1933, when Erskine ended it abruptly. Shaken by this, Nancy moved quickly into a new relationship with Peter Rodd, the son of a newly ennobled peer, and the two married in December 1933 after only a few months together. The marriage was not a happy one, almost from the start. Rodd was repeatedly unfaithful. They never had children, despite Nancy becoming pregnant several times and suffering miscarriages on each occasion. And by the late 1930s, the marriage existed largely in name only. The experience of the late 1930s hardened Nancy politically. She spent time in the south of France in early 1939 helping to care for Spanish refugees who had crossed the Pyrenees, fleeing the regime of General Francisco Franco, and this left a lasting impression on her. It reinforced her opposition to fascism at a time when two of her younger sisters, Diana and Unity, were deeply involved with the fascist movements in Britain and Germany. When the Second World War broke out in the autumn of 1939, Nancy threw herself into the British war effort as a volunteer in various capacities. It was during these years, in September 1942, that she met Gaston Pulowski, a French aide to General Charles de Gaulle, who was based in London as part of the Free French government in exile. Nancy fell deeply in love with him, and by most accounts he was the great love of her life, though his feelings for her were never quite as certain or committed as hers were for him. When the war ended in 1945, Nancy relocated to Paris, living near but not with Pulowski. Her marriage to Rodd was effectively over by this point, though they would not formally divorce until 1957. That same year, 1945, her fifth novel, The Pursuit of Love, was published. It became a significant success in post-war Britain, where readers were hungry for something light and escapist after 6 years of war. The book sold 200,000 copies in its first year and established Nancy as a serious literary name for the first time. On the strength of it, she was offered a regular column in the Sunday Times and became financially independent. She continued writing fiction into the late 1940s and 1950s, producing Love in a Cold Climate in 1949 and Don't Tell Alfred in 1960, both of which were well received. But from the early 1950s onwards, she began shifting towards historical biography, a genre she would spend much of the rest of her life working in. Her first biography focused on Madame de Pompadour, the famous mistress of King Louis XV of France. Critics were not entirely kind about it, suggesting it prioritized the scandalous over the scholarly. But it sold well and set the template for the biographical work that followed, including studies of Voltaire, King Louis XIV of France, and King Frederick II of Prussia. Her relationship with Pulowski remained unresolved throughout these years. They spent time together but never lived under the same roof, and Pulowski was openly unfaithful, building a considerable reputation as a womanizer in post-war French social circles. When he was appointed French ambassador to Italy in 1957, Nancy saw him rarely for 5 years. He eventually married someone else in 1969, a move that hurt her deeply. By the time she was writing her later books in the 1960s, her health was also declining. She suffered from persistent headaches and deteriorating eyesight, and she was later diagnosed with cancer. In 1972, she was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur in recognition of her contribution to French letters, a distinction she received with considerable pride. She died on the 30th of June, 1973, at her home in Versailles, aged 68. Her remains were returned to England and buried in the family plot. Pamela Mitford, the second of the 6 sisters, was born on the 25th of November 1907 in Wilbury in Wiltshire. She occupies a quieter place in the Mitford story than most of her siblings, which is partly a reflection of the life she chose to lead and partly a result of the fact that her choices were far less dramatic than those of the sisters who surrounded her. Where Nancy chased literary fame, Diana embraced fascism, Unity stalked Hitler, and Jessica fought alongside communists in Spain. Pamela spent her life in the countryside, tending animals, growing vegetables, riding horses, and keeping largely to herself. She was described by the poet John Betjeman, who knew her in the 1920s and 1930s and was clearly fond of her as the most rural of the Mitford sisters, a description that those who knew her seem to have found entirely accurate. Childhood was shaped by the same eccentric household as the rest of her siblings, but Pamela took from it a love of the natural world rather than a taste for politics or high society. She suffered from polio as a child, which left her partially lame in one leg throughout her life, but she did not allow this to define her or hold her back in any significant way. She rode horses, managed farms, and lived a physically active outdoor life despite the condition, though it did cause her increasing difficulty in her old age. Her marriage to the physicist and jockey Derek Jackson in 1936 was widely understood to be one of mutual convenience. Jackson was bisexual, and Pamela was almost certainly a lesbian, though she was so private about her personal life that little concrete evidence exists to confirm this with certainty. They did not have children, and despite being close in many respects, they eventually divorced in 1950. Following the end of their marriage, Pamela stayed on in Ireland at Tullymane Castle in County Tipperary, where they had lived together, renting the property from its new owner until 1958. During this period, a friendship with an Italian horse trainer and rider named Giuditta Tomasi developed into something more significant, and in 1958, Pamela moved to Switzerland to live with her. Her sister Jessica, in her characteristically direct fashion, referred to Tomasi as Pamela's German wife, though quite why she described the Italian woman as German remains unexplained. Pamela and Tomasi eventually parted ways, but Pamela stayed in Switzerland until the early 1970s, waiting until her dogs were old enough that she felt it would be unkind to uproot them and bring them back to England. That detail speaks volumes about her character and where her priorities lay throughout her life. She eventually returned to England in 1972 to settle in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire, bringing with her the distinction of having introduced the Appenzeller Spitzhauben breed of chicken to Britain from Switzerland. She spent her final years surrounded by her animals and her garden, visiting her sister Deborah in Ireland on occasion and spending some winters with Diana in South Africa. She died on the 12th of April, 1994, aged 86, after a fall down a flight of stairs had led to surgery from which she never fully recovered. Her last reported words were an inquiry about which horse had won that year's Grand National at Aintree, 3 days before she died. Diana Mitford was born on the 17th of June 1910 in London, the third daughter and fourth child of David and Sydney Freeman Mitford. Of all the 6 sisters, Diana was widely considered to be the most physically striking, and even by her late teens she had developed a charm and presence that drew people to her. Like most of her siblings, she was largely homeschooled, though in 1926 she was briefly sent to study in Paris for around 6 months. She could not have known it then, but she would end up spending a large part of her adult life in the French capital. At just 18 years of age, Diana secretly became engaged to Brian Guinness, heir to the famous Irish brewing dynasty. Her parents initially objected on account of her age, but eventually gave their blessing, and the wedding in January 1929 was considered one of the social events of the year. 2 sons followed in 1930 and 1931, but even before they had reached infancy, Diana's attention had begun to shift elsewhere. In February 1932, she met Sir Oswald Mosley at a party in London. Mosley had started his political career as a Conservative before moving to Labour, and when the party rejected his proposals for tackling mass unemployment after the Great Depression, he formed his own movement, which by the time he met Diana had become the British Union of Fascists. Despite both of them being married and a 14-year age gap between them, the two quickly began an affair. Diana left her husband and became Mosley's mistress, scandalizing British society. They eventually married on the 6th of October 1936 in a ceremony held at the home of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in Germany, with Adolf Hitler present at the event. Throughout the mid-1930s, Diana had been visiting Germany regularly, attending Nazi rallies and developing personal connections with the senior figures of the Nazi regime. She was a committed fascist, and the split this caused with her elder sister Nancy became one of the defining ruptures within the family. When war broke out in September 1939, the Mosleys' position in Britain became untenable. They were arrested in 1940, and Diana was imprisoned at Holloway Prison in London, where she remained until late 1943. After the war, the couple were effectively cast out of British society. They left Britain in 1951, eventually settling near Paris, with occasional visits to South Africa, where their politics attracted less hostility. Diana continued to write and publish during these years, editing a Sourcement political magazine, producing a biography of Wallis Simpson, and writing 2 personal memoirs. She died in Paris on the 11th of August 2003, following a stroke aged 93. Unity Mitford was born on the 8th of August 1914, just days after Britain entered the First World War. Her parents named her Unity as a gesture reflecting the national mood. There is a further detail that many have found extraordinary, given how her life turned out. She was conceived in a town called Swastika in Ontario, Canada. Unity struggled throughout her childhood to find her place within a household full of dominant personalities. That need to belong to something entirely her own would come to shape the choices she made as a young adult. In the early 1930s, she developed a strong affinity for fascism, influenced by her mother, her sister Diana, and her brother Tom. She and her younger sister Jessica, who was developing equally strong communist sympathies, shared a bedroom at the family home in Oxfordshire, divided down the middle with a chalk line. Jessica put up pictures of Lenin on her side. Unity put up a photograph of Hitler on hers. In the autumn of 1933, Unity travelled to Germany with Diana and attended the Nazi rally in Nuremberg, where she encountered Hitler for the first time and became immediately infatuated with him. She returned to Munich the following summer and enrolled in a language school, from where she began a determined campaign to get into Hitler's inner circle. She tracked his movements and spent months sitting daily near the entrance of a restaurant he was known to frequent. After approximately 10 months, Hitler invited her to his table. She later described the encounter to her father as the most wonderful day of her life. Hitler found the young British woman intriguing, describing her as a perfect specimen of Aryan womanhood. Over the following years, she met him on more than 100 occasions, making her the British person who spent the most time in his company after his rise to power. As war between Britain and Germany became inevitable in 1939, Unity found herself torn between her worship of Hitler and her love for her native country. On the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, she shot herself in the head with a pistol in Munich. The bullet did not kill her, but lodged in her skull. Hitler visited her in hospital and covered her medical bills. Her mother and youngest sister Deborah collected her from Switzerland in January 1940 and brought her back to England, where those who knew her found her to be an entirely different person. She never recovered her mental faculties and died on the 28th of May, 1948, from meningitis after the bullet shifted in her head. She was 33 years old. Jessica Mitford was born on the 11th of September, 1917, and was known throughout her life as Decca. Where Unity had embraced fascism, Jessica went in the opposite direction entirely, developing strong communist sympathies that made her the red sheep of the family. In the spring of 1937, at just 19, she eloped from Britain with Esmond Romilly, a socialist and nephew-in-law of Winston Churchill, and the two headed for Spain to support the communist side in the civil war against Francisco Franco. They eventually married in France in May 1937 and later emigrated to the United States in 1939. Esmond enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force when war broke out and went missing over the North Sea in November 1941 during a raid on Hamburg. He was 23 years old. Jessica rebuilt her life in America, marrying lawyer and civil rights activist Robert Treuhaft in 1943 and becoming a US citizen the following year. As a writer, she came into her own in the 1960s. Her memoir, Hons and Rebels, published in 1960, offered a vivid account of her upbringing and her resistance to the fascist politics that surrounded her as a child. Her follow-up, The American Way of Death in 1963, was a meticulously researched investigation into how the American funeral industry exploited grieving families, and it became a bestseller that led directly to a congressional hearing on industry regulation. It established her as one of the foremost investigative journalists of her generation. She continued writing and reporting for decades, covering subjects ranging from the civil rights movement to the prison system, and died in the summer of 1996 from lung cancer, aged 78. In keeping with the views she had expressed in her most famous book, her funeral cost just $58. Deborah Vivian Freeman Mitford, known to her family and later her in-laws as Debo, was born on the 31st of March 1920 at Asthall Manor in Oxfordshire. She was the youngest of the 6 sisters and, in many ways, the one whose life took the most unexpected turn. Where several of her siblings became notorious for their politics or their personal scandals, Deborah became a duchess, and the work she put into that role over the course of more than 5 decades left a legacy that is still very much visible today. Her childhood was not an easy one. Her parents had wanted a second son and made little effort to hide their disappointment when another daughter arrived instead. She was also the youngest in a large and frequently chaotic household, which meant she spent much of her early life being overshadowed and teased by older siblings who all seemed to have stronger personalities and louder voices. Like most of the Mitford children, she had little formal schooling, being taught instead by a governess and various tutors. She grew up fox hunting on Saturdays and ice skating on Sundays, and from an early age she shared with her sister Pamela a deep love of the countryside and rural life that would remain with her throughout her life. The political tensions that tore through the Mitford family during the 1930s affected Deborah too, though in a different way than they affected the others. She was still a young teenager when Diana began her relationship with Oswald Mosley, and the family became drawn into the upper circles of European fascism. She was barely an adult when Unity moved to Germany to spend time in Hitler's inner circle. Deborah had no sympathy for any of those political views and was throughout her life a fairly traditional British conservative, but she was also deeply loyal to her family, and that loyalty meant she tried to maintain relationships with all of her sisters, regardless of what they believed or had done. She later wrote that her love for Diana had overcome the difficulties created by her politics, and she remained a defender of Unity's memory long after her sister's death, pushing back against those who tried to reduce Unity's story to simple caricature. This role as the peacemaker and steadying presence in the family was put to the test very early. It was Deborah who travelled with her mother to Switzerland in the winter of 1939 to collect Unity after she had shot herself on the day Britain declared war on Germany. What they found when they arrived was deeply distressing, and Deborah wrote about the experience movingly many decades later, describing her sister as someone she no longer recognised. Not long after returning from that trip, Deborah agreed to marry Andrew Cavendish, a younger son of Edward Cavendish, the 10th Duke of Devonshire. They married in 1941. At the time of their marriage, Andrew was not the heir to the dukedom, but that changed in September 1944 when his older brother William was killed in Belgium while serving with the Coldstream Guards during the Allied advance through Western Europe. William had married Kathleen Kennedy, the sister of the future American President John F. Kennedy, just 4 months before his death, a connection that later brought Deborah and Andrew into the Kennedy circle. When Andrew's father died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1950, Andrew became the 11th Duke of Devonshire, and Deborah, who could not have anticipated such a title when she married 9 years earlier, became Duchess. With that title came Chatsworth House, one of the most celebrated stately homes in England. The estate in Derbyshire had been in the Cavendish family since 1549, and the main house, a sprawling building of 300 rooms spread across 81,000 square metres, had been developed over centuries into one of the great centres of the British aristocracy. But when Andrew and Deborah took over in 1950, the financial situation was extremely difficult. Death duties on the estate, combined with the heavy taxes imposed on the landed gentry in Britain after the war, had left the family owing around £7 million to the government, a sum equivalent to well over £200 million in today's money. Many of their advisors believed the situation was beyond saving and recommended selling off large portions of the estate. Deborah and Andrew refused. Instead, they sold a number of valuable works of art and a second historic property, Hardwick Hall, and committed themselves to restoring Chatsworth and turning it into a major tourist destination. It was an enormous undertaking. The house itself had not been used as the family's primary residence for years and had been leased out as a girls' boarding school for a period, leaving it in a poor state. Deborah took charge of the restoration, overseeing the repainting and repair of the family rooms and the renovation of the common areas. By 1959, the house was sufficiently restored for them to move in, and from there, the transformation of the estate gathered pace. The gardens surrounding the house were replanted and developed, and over time the estate became largely self-sufficient, with produce from the farm and gardens supplying a restaurant on the grounds. A farm shop was later added. Chatsworth also sits within the Peak District, one of the most scenic parts of England, and the combination of the house's history, its gardens, and the surrounding landscape made it an increasingly powerful draw for visitors. Deborah was central to all of it, reportedly manning the ticket office herself in the early years when the house first opened to the public. By the 1990s, Chatsworth had become one of the most visited tourist destinations in England, attracting over 500,000 visitors a year and placing it on a level with institutions like the Tower of London. Her personal life during these decades was not without difficulty. Andrew was repeatedly unfaithful, and his struggles with alcohol were significant enough that Deborah eventually gave him an ultimatum in the 1980s. She wrote in her memoir that from that day until the day he died, he never had another drink. He died in 2004 at the age of 84, having become a figure closely associated with the revival of Chatsworth, alongside his wife. Deborah had also suffered considerable loss as a parent. Of the several children she carried, 4 either died at birth or shortly afterwards. 2 healthy children, Emma and Peregrine, were born in 1943 and 1944, and a third, Sophia, arrived in 1957. In recognition of her contributions to the Royal Collection Trust, Deborah was made a Dame Commander of the Royal Victorian Order by Queen Elizabeth II in 1999. The Cavendish family's wealth, which had been in such a precarious state when she and Andrew took over in 1950, had by the time of her death grown to an estimated £905 million, according to the Sunday Times Rich List, a transformation driven in large part by the decisions she had made over more than 50 years. Deborah died on the 24th of September 2014 at the age of 94, having outlived all of her sisters by more than a decade. At her funeral, more than 600 members of staff, hundreds of members of the public, and representatives of the royal family lined the route from Chatsworth House to the church where she was buried. Elvis Presley, her favourite musician, was played at the service. It was a fitting farewell to the last of the Mitford sisters and to one of the more remarkable family stories that 20th century Britain produced.